Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us back here on the program today is author of the new book, Pearl Harbor. He's joining us here with sharing the 75th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941. There's also new information that was uncovered from years of research about the historical moment when the armada of 354 Japanese warplanes, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and midget submarines savagely attacked the United States, killing more than 2,400 Americans and forcing America's entry into the World War. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, New York Times bestselling author of Rocket Men, the author of Pearl Harbor, Craig Nelson. Craig, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, there's so much detail, just like in your Rocket Men book. You know, I started diving into this, and I'm thinking, God, there's so much. This is something you really want to take time to read and ingest here. A lot of research went into this.
Yeah, it was me and a team of about a dozen guys and gals spent almost 5 years on this. About 15 months ago, the book in your hands was over 1 million pages of raw documents.
My goodness. Now, how did you come to put all this together to create Pearl Harbor?
Well, it was actually very difficult because the entire situation is so chaotic. You know, you have the battle, the attack itself. You have many, many things happening simultaneously. So at first I tried to do it with a timeline. But then you'd read 20 pages and then you go back and it would be the same time. It was too frustrating. So I finally did it by geography. I alternate back and forth between Washington and Tokyo and the different situations, and Hawaii and China and the different situations going on there. And that was the only way we could provide a structure for what was in fact a very chaotic moment.
Now, Pearl Harbor is one of those things that at first, you know, as a child, as I was growing up, and you learn history, you learn basically they came in, it was a surprise attack, we didn't know about this, and that entered us into the war. But I'm sure that as you were doing the research and over the years, as you hear more and more, you grow up and you're able to assimilate more information, that you realize there was really a lot more to this than what we originally were taught in school.
Well, that was what was really fascinating, because a lot of the new material that we got was about the information about the Japanese government. And one of the sort of turning points that we discovered was the fact that the Americans had an opinion of the Japanese government as being just like the Nazis, as being this sort of unified force of fascist nationalists. And in fact, the government was very chaotic. They had 15 prime ministers in 14 years. The Army was constantly fighting with the Navy. The Navy was constantly fighting with the civilian government, who was fighting with the Army. And there were many moments, in fact, during this chaotic upheaval that we probably could have negotiated a peace treaty and not had Pearl Harbor at all.
Now, it's my understanding that one of the reasons also for this was that the Japanese were actually being drained economically by America. Now, these are some of these things that you hear over the years, and I'm wondering, in your research, did you find any of that to be true?
Well, what happened was that Roosevelt wanted to use embargoes because we supplied 80% of Japanese petroleum. He wanted to use embargoes as this sort of tightening. He said he wanted to be able to slip a noose around their necks and jerk it every so often. But behind his back, Atchison at State and Morgenthau at Treasury combined two policies to create a complete embargo of petroleum to Japan. And that drove them into a corner.
Now, let's talk about the Japanese perspective and how they came about creating this attack, this idea, this strategy, if you will.
Well, the Japanese, starting in 1931, basically the Japanese government was taken over by this small clique of nationalists who threatened to assassinate, and did assassinate, any civilian leader who stood in their way. And they were able to actually get the media on their side, who promoted their adventures as being this fantastic patriotic outpouring that would create a whole new kind of Japan. And it was an amazingly small group of people that were able to do this, but they eventually took over most of China, and then they sent 40,000 troops into French Indochina, and at the beginning of 1941, they were going to launch Operation Number One, which would be a simultaneous invasion of all of Asia between India and the Kamchatka Peninsula, and it would create this entire empire there. And for them, Pearl Harbor was merely a very small sideline item. It was to protect their flank from the only force that could interfere with this huge conquest, which was the American fleet at Pearl Harbor.
Now, what was it about Pearl Harbor that really had you make this effort here?
Well, I really feel that the way America is today began at Pearl Harbor. Her leadership role on the global stage, the creation of the strongest fighting force the world has ever known, the size of her intelligence agencies, her State Department and foreign aid programs, the birth of the nuclear arsenal, and the 70 years, what we call the Pax Americana, that we haven't had a World War III, all began at Pearl Harbor, and all of those things are with us to this day.
Now, what were some surprises about this as you were putting this book together?
I guess my biggest surprise was that we've constantly been told that there are all these warnings that occurred, and in fact there's sort of a famous policy book about how there are all these signals, but they were within all this noise, and if we'd separated the signals from the noise, we could have told what was happening. But in fact, we only had one real warning that they were going to attack Hawaii. Well, there were actually two. There was a rumor in January 1941, 12 months ahead of time, that the Peruvian embassy had heard this warning, but the Americans completely discounted it. And then in August of 1941, a guy named Dusan Popov shows up at FBI headquarters. And Popov is a fantastic character. He was a triple agent. He worked simultaneously for intelligence in Nazi Germany, British, and the Yugoslavs, and he was really a model for James Bond. And he had arrived in America with a 3-page questionnaire, and a third of that questionnaire was about Pearl Harbor. And he took it to the FBI and said, "This really means something. You really got to look into this." And J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't have anything to do with him because he couldn't believe a triple agent could be trusted, and he knew that Popov was having an affair with the star of Cat People, Simone, and he thought that was morally reprehensible, so he wouldn't believe him.
Now, I know it's really interesting as you talk about that, the idea that we somehow knew that this attack was going to happen and that we really didn't do much to prepare for that. And it's really interesting because it was also a mysterious thing in the New York Magazine for what was called Chicago's favorite game, the Deadly Double. Tell us what that was all about.
Yeah, everyone loves hearing this story. It's really wild. So there's a series of ads in the New Yorker of November 22nd, 1941. So this is 3 weeks before the attack. And it says, "Have you tried Chicago's favorite game, the Deadly Double?" And the ad proposes that you have this game on hand if you're stuck in an air raid shelter. And the two pictures of the dice in the game are 12 and 7. And the FBI, after the attack, thought this was very suspicious, and they went to the New Yorker offices, and they found out that the ad was paid for in cash, so it couldn't be tracked down financially. The guy who brought them the ad brought it in mechanical, so it was all ready to produce, and they tried to track down the game and the company that made it in the ad, and neither of them existed. So it's a mystery to this day.
You got to love those mysteries. There's no doubt about that. Now, it's really interesting, too, because with Pearl Harbor, there ended up becoming some, I guess, for lack of a better word, atrocities here in the United States, especially in California, where that's where we started detaining Japanese detainees as a result, even though these were actual American-born citizens who owned land, and they actually seized and took land from these people. And, you kind of take a look at this and go, okay, so what's the real deal going on here?
Well, this is a really shocking story. What happened is that the admiral in Hawaii, Kimmel, insisted that this all happened because of saboteurs, that if that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii had contributed to the success of Pearl Harbor. And when his quotes were released in the first investigation of Pearl Harbor, the Roberts Commission, it incited the head of the Army in the West Coast to insist that America West Coast was in danger, that any minute Japanese troops were going to arrive, and they would be helped by the vast number of Japanese Americans. And in fact, on Hawaii, no one believed this, and practically no one was interned on Hawaii. Only about 1,000 people who were either part of the government or had strong ties or who were suspicious, were interned. But because of this sort of hysteria that hit the West Coast, the military insisted that they needed to intern people in war areas, and the head of the Western Command had the entire West Coast declared a war area. So all of the sort of internment happened from this one region because of this one man's hysteria.
Now, I think what makes Pearl Harbor unique, too, especially the attack, is this was seemingly one of those first times they came to understand that the planes were actually using torpedoes and not bombs. And it was really interesting to watch documentaries about that where you realize, wow, that made this pretty difficult for us to be able to defend something like this.
Well, the difficulty was the fact that Kimmel, the admiral again, believed that no one could use torpedoes in Pearl Harbor because the water was too shallow. If you dropped a torpedo, it would just sink into the ground. So he couldn't even imagine this, even though there had recently been a famous battle called Taranto between the British and the Italians, where exactly that had happened. And we now know that the Japanese sent a research team to Taranto to take notes to help with Pearl Harbor. And we also now know that they got the idea for the technique to use in this attack from an American officer named Bradley Fisk, who invented the technique where you use a spiraling dive to avoid enemy fire. Then you hover about 20 feet above the water. So this is really, really low. You adjust your course to help set for the torpedo, and you release only about 1,500 feet before the target, and then you have to do an immediate climb to keep from running into the target's towers. And one of the pilots said, we knew we were flying too low when we dropped our torpedoes and the water splashed on our wings.
It was interesting. About 10 years ago, we decided to do a Veterans Day special, and I just happened to know someone who was one of the last of the World War II veterans. And what made this particular segment so unique is that he was actually in Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. And he was a gunner on a ship. He was in the Navy, and he was talking about how he actually shot one of the planes down. But to hear him recall this story, putting that human element of being up front and up close and personal, it was almost eerie, because it was really like, even though you weren't there, you were reliving something of such magnitude. And it must have been amazing. Did you get an opportunity to talk with any veterans who had actually been in Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, we interviewed some of them, but because of their age, in fact, we found out that the material they had given to oral history archives decades earlier had a lot more detail and a lot more material than we found in our interviews. So we actually turned our interviews over to sort of non-traditional survivors who hadn't been talked to. So we interviewed civilians who were children at the time. And we also found a group of Navy wives and children who hid from the attack in a cave on Ford Island, which is in the middle of Pearl Harbor. And that was quite an incredible story. Some of the most amazing, first of all, one of the most amazing things about this situation is that Kimmel had gotten a war warning, which means he was supposed to set sail and be at sea when this happened. And almost no one in the Navy in Washington could imagine that he was still in the harbor. And part of the terrible problem with defending yourself on a boat from an overhead plane is that the guns are primarily meant to shoot shells 20 miles away. They're battleships, and they're these huge cannon, and they don't really have much to shoot a plane flying right over your head. And the other thing that happened was to find out how many of the survivors suffered incredible trauma. There were 43,000 servicemen stationed on Oahu at that moment, and the median age was 19. And because this happened Sunday morning, the airfields and the ships were staffed primarily by even younger people than that, because all of the senior officers were asleep in their beds, in their houses and in their apartments. So you hear this incredible trauma. One of my favorite stories, well, one of my most moving stories, is from a man named Sterling Kale, who 5 years after Pearl Harbor was on the beach with his new 2-year-old son, and a rogue wave came up and swept the boy out to sea. And Kale ran into the water to save him, and when his feet hit the water, he froze and was paralyzed because he had fell into a terror, because he had spent 5 years before, he had spent Pearl Harbor fishing bodies out of the harbor, and this was the first time he tried to go in the water since. And luckily, they had adopted a dog from the Canine Corps who swam out and grabbed the little boy and brought him in. But that was the last time Sterling Kale was ever even able to walk by a beach. He had developed such trauma from being in that situation.
Now, there are ships that are recognized, such as the USS Arizona, but one of the more interesting stories I remember reading in the book was that of the USS Utah. Tell us about that.
Well, the Utah was a target ship, and it was moored next to where a aircraft carrier would normally be, the Enterprise, and we imagine that the Japanese thought they were hitting an Enterprise because there was no reason to hit a target ship, and they had absolutely nothing to defend themselves with, and they were really held hostage. But one of my favorite discoveries in doing this research was finding a picture and an article from 1914, and it shows the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, attending the laying of the keel of a ship called Number 39 in Brooklyn. And Number 39 will become the Arizona. And it reminded me of how much Franklin Roosevelt loved the Navy. While he was president, he personally selected the admirals. He raised the service's budget every year. He kept calling the Navy us and the Army them until George Marshall made him cut it out. And when he got the final message from the Japanese on December 6th, he was one of the few people in Washington who thought this might mean war. So he called the head of the Navy, and when that didn't work out, it didn't occur to him to call the Army. So that was the situation there with that amazing thing, and it was so fantastic to see that moment. And I know some of your listeners will be upset to learn that the Arizona is a New Yorker and from Brooklyn, but we have to face facts.
You know, there's no doubt about the accuracies that you really have to take a look at here. And you know, what's really interesting is one of the things that you don't think about, and I certainly didn't myself over the years until I watched that movie some years back called Pearl Harbor. And I think one of the most astonishing moments of that movie was when the attack is happening, when you hear the emergency horn go off, and they're showing this nurse with this look on her face that basically says, we're in for a long, hard night here. You know, and you start thinking of the awesome responsibility that the emergency response and the medical teams dealt with on this, you know, basically small island at this particular point, you know, and did you research that as well?
Yes, we found a nurse named Connor who was stuck at Hickam, which is the air base right next to Pearl Harbor. And at one point, they were dropping the bombs right next to the hospital. So she took a garbage can lid to cover herself while she was hiding from the bombs, and someone tried to take her garbage can lid away from her. And later that night, she looked down, and her entire shoes were covered in blood because there was so much blood coming over the 12 hours of taking care of people that it ran over her shoes.
Now, what's also interesting to note, too, is how in the morning of the attack is how people were thinking that it was just an accidental plane crash at first. And they just kind of passed it off and went about their day until they realized, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on here.
Well, I was in New York for 9/11, and the exact same thing happened here, where I got a phone call saying there's been an accident at the World Trade Center. And at Pearl Harbor, they were constantly having, you know, aerial demonstrations and maneuvers, so people just thought it was another maneuver.
Now, based on your research purely, did we know or did we have foresight about this attack?
We knew that the Japanese were going to attack something, but we had no idea it was going to be Hawaii. We assumed it was going to be the Philippines, and one of the sort of political intrigues of this story is the fact that the 3 people who messed up in Hawaii were all demoted, but the 3 people who messed up in the Philippines were not, because of Douglas MacArthur's political status. And that's one interesting political story. But primarily, we so dismissed the Japanese as being inferior to us military-wise, even though they had better torpedoes and a better fighter plane, and the military kept telling Roosevelt, "Oh, there's no way they'll attack us. We're so much more powerful than they are. It's not conceivable." And I believe that led to him and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, being belligerent in their negotiations with the Japanese. And until November 5th, 1941, a little over a month before the attack, Roosevelt gets a memo from the head of the Navy and the Army saying, actually, things don't look so good. Japan is very powerful and you need to play for time. And from then on, he does everything he can to try and cool things off and negotiate a peace with Japan, including writing a letter directly to Emperor Hirohito.
Now, this was considered the Day of Infamy. For listeners who may not know what that is, tell us about that.
Well, according to the Geneva Conventions, all nations were supposed to announce and declare war before attacking somebody. And the Japanese actually didn't care about giving any notice to Britain over when they took over Hong Kong and Singapore, but the Navy did care about giving notice to the United States. So it was decided that the ambassadors in Washington would hand over this message announcing the end of treaty negotiations 30 minutes before Pearl Harbor was attacked. So it was 30 minutes, but still it was something. Well, they ended up not doing that. What happened was that there was an Army corporal stationed at the Tokyo cable office, and he arranged to delay the message from Roosevelt to Hirohito and the message from the Foreign Office to the diplomats in Washington so that both of them arrived too late to do anything.
And it's not much of a secret now, but even, the leader of Japan, he agonized over whether or not to do this. They really didn't want to do something like this, did they?
Well, there was a very interesting thing that happened at the end of the war where Tojo, the prime minister who really led the nation into the war, said, "Oh, if only Roosevelt's memo to Hirohito had come a little earlier, things might have been different." But when Hirohito was interviewed after the war, he said that he did all he could to stop it, and if he had tried to do more, he would have either been locked up in an asylum or assassinated.
Again, like I said, there's so much here, and I've started reading this, and I'm like, it's an easy read, but it's amazing how you get wrapped in the detail. It really pulls you in here. And what was one of the biggest reasons you felt motivated to put this story out there?
I felt that it had been 50 years since the last really big book on Pearl Harbor had been researched, and there had been all this sort of junky stuff published about, maybe Roosevelt was involved and all this kind of thing. Well, the people responsible, we know the people responsible for Pearl Harbor was the Japanese. Anyway, there's just been all this sort of junk history published on this topic, and I decided it was time to really definitively, 50 years after the last definitive history, do another one and set the record straight.
Very good, and the world's going to be a lot better for knowing, this history here, and it's really amazing how you've got, names of seamen, of just everybody in here, and, how you came to find these stories, and, it's just such an incredible book here for people to be able to pick up. The book is Pearl Harbor. It's From Infamy to Greatness. Our guest today, Craig Nelson. Is there a website people can find out more about how to get the book and more about what you've written here?
Yeah, my website is craignelson.us.
Craig, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
You bet. Thank you, sir.
You bet. I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, pick up Pearl Harbor. Great story here. Learn more about U.S. history as it actually was. You can also discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and stay up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 Radio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Beyond 50 Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.